In the blurry hospital surveillance footage, a young woman sits silently in the waiting room, her eyes empty, then quietly stands up and walks outside. An action that seems completely ordinary. But no one knew that that very moment would be the last time anyone saw her alive, and also the starting point of a horrifying case that was both silent and chilling. On a cold morning in Oshawa, Canada, in a quiet apartment complex where everything moved slowly and almost nothing seemed noteworthy, a call was made to a plumbing team with a very simple description: a clogged pipe, water not draining. This was the kind of job they had handled hundreds of times before. Nothing dangerous, nothing unusual, no reason for concern. When they arrived, everything looked completely normal. They began the work following their usual procedure, slowly feeding equipment deep into the drainage system, little by little, initially thinking it was just a typical blockage like hair, debris, or something that had been stuck for a long time. But as the equipment began to pull the object out, the feeling immediately changed. What they had encountered was unlike anything they had ever seen before. Not garbage, not a household item. These workers had just discovered traces of a brutal murder in which parts of a body had been disposed of through the plumbing system. The work was immediately stopped. Another call was made, this time to the police. Within less than an hour, the area around the apartment was sealed off, investigators arrived, and an entirely different process began, turning an ordinary apartment into the scene of a serious crime. But as the search continued, what was found inside revealed that this was not a random incident or an isolated accident, but the traces of a crime that had been concealed for a long time. And from that moment on, an investigation began, leading detectives to follow the trail of a man who seemed almost invisible yet was behind one of the most haunting cases in Oshawa. In early October 2008, after a period of chatting on a dating website, Johnny Altiner received an invitation to meet from a woman using the name Sheena. Her profile showed a young, friendly person living in Edmonton, and her way of speaking created a sense of closeness and quickly built trust. The two soon arranged their first meeting. When Johnny suggested picking a specific location, Sheena refused to provide an exact address for safety reasons and instead sent him an email containing very detailed directions, guiding him step by step through familiar landmarks in the neighborhood, eventually leading to an alley behind a row of houses. Although these directions were somewhat unusual, given that their prior conversation had gone smoothly, Johnny still decided to go. That evening he drove to the exact location as instructed, and no one knew that from that moment on, Johnny had completely disappeared. However, what truly caught investigators' attention was not only what they found, but what was missing. There were no signs suggesting this was the first time. When the DNA samples were analyzed, another name began to emerge, linked to a disappearance from nearly a decade earlier, a case that had never been solved and had almost faded into obscurity over time. From that point on, the case was no longer a single investigation, but became a series of larger questions. Who was Adam Strong really? What had he been doing in the years before? And how many other secrets had yet to be uncovered? To understand what happened inside that apartment, it is necessary to go back a few months earlier, to a time when nothing seemed out of the ordinary, a time when the victim was still alive. The victim was identified as Rory Hatch, born in 1999 in Oshawa, a quiet suburban city in the province of Ontario, Canada. In her early years, she was known as a bright, energetic girl with a strong sense of discipline. Rory joined the Royal Canadian Army Cadets, where she not only adapted well, but also stood out among many of her peers. At just 13 years old, she was twice recognized as an outstanding cadet, an achievement that showed she once had a very solid foundation and great potential for the future. Those who had interacted with Rory described her as warm, approachable, and especially caring toward others. She loved animals, enjoyed taking care of the elderly, and consistently showed a level of empathy beyond her age. At that point in time, there were no signs that her life would take a completely different direction. However, as she entered her teenage years, everything began to change. At the age of 14, Rory was first exposed to substances, a decision that became a turning point. From then on, she gradually fell into a period that lasted for years, marked by struggles with self-control and the environment around her. Her life became more complicated, not only because of personal challenges, but also due to factors within her family, where many relationships and past circumstances were unstable. Despite this, What is notable is that Rory never completely gave up on changing her life. In the final 6 months before her disappearance, those around her began to notice a clear shift. She returned to school, found a job, and started rebuilding a more stable routine. Rory was also in a relationship, and more importantly, she was pregnant. This was a major turning point in her life, not as a burden, but as a motivation for her to start over. Her family and friends believed that this time, things were truly moving in the right direction. Rory was no longer the girl being pulled along by past mistakes, but someone actively trying to regain control of her life. A new future, though not yet complete, had begun to take shape. But at the very moment when everything seemed to be improving, everything suddenly stopped. On August 29, 2017, Rory was taken to the hospital after showing signs of psychological instability. There was no clear information about the exact cause, only that she was going through an unstable state and needed to be evaluated. Security cameras at the hospital recorded Rory sitting in the waiting room. She did not appear panicked or out of control. Everything looked fairly normal, a patient waiting to be called. After a short period of time, the two people who had accompanied her left, leaving Rory alone. Not long after, just about 15 minutes from when she first appeared on camera, Rory stood up and walked out of the hospital before being called in to see a doctor. That was the last time Rory Hatch was seen. In the days that followed, when she did not return to the youth support center and also did not contact her family, concern began to grow. Some people believe she may have run away, but those close to Rory believed that did not make sense. She was pregnant, had a job, and was trying to stabilize her life. There was no reason for her to disappear without telling anyone. A missing person report was quickly filed with the police. But at that point, no one knew that they were not just searching for a missing person. They were beginning a murder investigation. On September 11, 2017, in the Oshawa Harbor area, a man and his nephew were fishing. The water was calm, with nothing unusual, until they noticed a strange object floating not far away. From the initial distance, it did not appear unusual, looking like a bag of trash or the carcass of an animal drifting in the water. They used a fishing rod and a net to pull the object closer to the shore. But as it got closer, the shape of the object did not resemble trash. It did not resemble anything they had seen during their previous fishing trips. And within seconds, confusion turned into clear realization. What was floating on the surface of the water was not trash, but a trace of a human body. The man immediately called the police. The area was quickly secured when authorities arrived at the scene. What they confirmed shortly afterward turned an ordinary fishing trip into the starting point of a serious case. However, the investigation was not simple. Because the body had been exposed to the environment for a period of time, most identifying features had been significantly affected. There were no documents, no direct information to establish identity. This forced investigators to rely on forensic methods, particularly DNA analysis, to determine who the victim was. This process did not happen quickly. It took nearly 2 months after comparisons with databases and DNA samples from relatives for the victim's identity to be confirmed. It was Rory Hatch, the 17-year-old girl who had disappeared without leaving any trace just weeks earlier. This discovery officially turned a missing person case into a homicide case. But at that time, the police still did not have answers to the most important questions. What had happened to her? And who was behind it all? After the victim was identified as Rory Hatch, the investigation officially shifted toward a homicide case. But it almost immediately ran into difficulties. There were no witnesses, no cameras capturing her movements after she left the hospital, and no direct evidence pointing to a suspect. The final period of Rory's life became a gap that investigators could not fill. Several theories were put forward, including the possibility that she left on her own or encountered issues related to substance use again, but her family did not believe that. To them, Rory was in one of the most stable periods of her life. There was no reason for her to disappear without contacting anyone. However, without additional concrete evidence, these suspicions could not be developed into a clear investigative direction. As time passed, the case gradually fell into a dead end, with no indication that the truth would be uncovered anytime soon. Until December 2017, when a plumbing issue occurred at an apartment building. Returning to the unit where plumbers had discovered unusual signs, the police began a thorough search. By tracing evidence from the plumbing system and identifying the connected unit as belonging to Adam Straw, they quickly approached the scene. There were no signs of resistance or attempts to conceal anything, and Strawn's reaction from the very first moments immediately drew investigators' attention. As soon as the door opened, he appeared unusually calm, as if he had already prepared for being discovered. Instead of denying or showing panic, he admitted that the police had found the right person, while directly implying that something inside the apartment was connected to a body. This attitude not only demonstrated a clear lack of emotion, but also made investigators realize they were dealing with a situation far more serious than initially expected. During the process of restraining and escorting the suspect away from the scene, Strong continued to provide directional information, stating that the remaining parts of the victim could be found in the apartment's freezer. This detail immediately accelerated the search with a high level of priority. When examining this area, investigators discovered multiple key pieces of evidence that helped confirm the victim's identity, including identifying features that matched the records of Rory Hatch. These findings played a crucial role in directly linking the suspect to the missing victim. Forensic examination results showed that the victim had multiple signs of injury prior to death. However, the exact cause of death could not be determined with absolute certainty due to the condition of the body and the absence of some critical parts needed for examination. Even so, experts still had sufficient basis to conclude that this was a death caused by external factors, not an accident. In addition, traces of stimulants were also found in the test samples, a factor that was included in the analysis to clarify the circumstances leading up to the incident. When questioned about the victim's identity, Strong did not provide a clear answer. He avoided the question, changed his wording, and did not directly confirm anything, even though he had previously made suggestive statements. This inconsistency indicated a familiar tactic, controlling information at a minimal level to avoid self-incrimination, while still maintaining an outward appearance of cooperation. The search of the apartment continued to expand and quickly revealed many additional important details. Strong's living space was cluttered, disorganized, and showed multiple unusual signs. Among the items seized, police found tools that could be related to restraining a victim, along with several dangerous objects. Notably, a hammer that was recovered was later determined to contain Rory Hatch's DNA, further strengthening the direct link between the suspect and acts of violence. In addition, several of the victim's personal belongings were also found inside the apartment, including shoes and items containing biological traces. Bloodstains were documented in multiple locations throughout the apartment, particularly in the area leading into the bedroom, indicating that the incident most likely occurred there. These pieces of evidence formed a tightly connected chain, allowing investigators to logically reconstruct the sequence of events. When examining Strong's electronic devices, police discovered browsing history related to violent and extremist content. Although these elements did not directly constitute a crime, they contributed to reflecting the suspect's psychological tendencies and behavior, thereby supporting the analysis of motive. Another discovery that increased the level of danger at the scene was the presence of an improvised explosive device that had not detonated. Immediately, the bomb disposal unit was deployed to ensure safety and neutralize the device according to control procedures. This indicated that the apartment was not only connected to a homicide, but also posed additional serious risks. A deeper analysis of the recruitment behavior showed that the group behind it did not select targets randomly, but followed very specific criteria. They focused on young women from smaller cities, those without international work experience, but with a clear desire to change their lives. The victims' social media profiles often reflected an interest in fashion and beauty, along with carefully curated personal images, which made it easier for the perpetrators to approach and build trust. To reinforce credibility, the recruiters also created fake accounts of successful models, posting professional photos, luxurious lifestyles, and international projects, forming a false verification system that led victims to believe they were stepping into a genuine opportunity. From an initial apartment check, investigators quickly realized they were facing a far more complex case than expected. What was discovered not only helped clarify the death of Rory Hatch, but also opened an entirely new chapter in the investigation where the past and present began to intersect and secrets buried for years gradually came to light. After the evidence from the apartment began to directly link to the victim, police returned to interrogate Adam Strong from a completely different position. No longer just someone connected to the case, he had now become the primary suspect in the investigation. However, Strong's demeanor in the interrogation room did not match typical reactions. He did not panic, nor did he completely deny the allegations, but instead chose a cold and calculated approach. Strong admitted that he knew Rory and that she had been to his apartment multiple times. However, when questioned about what happened afterward, he avoided taking direct responsibility. Instead, he attempted to construct a narrative in which he was only involved in events that occurred after the victim had died, rather than being the person who directly committed the crime. This was a clear legal strategy, creating distance between himself and the criminal act. During the interrogation, Strong spoke about his subsequent actions with an almost emotionless attitude, as if describing routine work. He even mentioned choosing specific times to act when fewer people were around, indicating a certain level of calculation. However, these very details became problematic. The more he spoke, the more elements he provided that allowed investigators and prosecutors to reconstruct the entire sequence of events. Initially, authorities could only charge Strong in relation to interference with a body, as there was not yet sufficient direct evidence to prove homicide, and Strong appeared to believe that if he kept his account at that level, he could avoid more serious charges. Even so, Strong never formally admitted that he was the perpetrator responsible for the deaths of Rory or Candace. He maintained the position that he was only involved afterward, while attempting to explain away incriminating evidence in a way that reduced his level of responsibility. When confronted with the DNA results of Candace found on a tool recovered from the apartment, he claimed it was the result of failing to dispose of the item in time, an explanation that showed he was aware of the seriousness of the evidence, yet still avoided admitting the core act. By November 2018, nearly a year after parts of Rory's remains were discovered, prosecutors officially filed charges against Adam Strong. He was charged with first-degree murder in connection with Rory Hatch and manslaughter in relation to Candace Fitzpatrick, a victim who had been missing since 2008. Notably, at that time, Candace's body had still not been found, and Strong had not made any direct confession. However, the chain of forensic evidence, combined with behavioral factors and the connections between events, was considered sufficient to bring the case to trial. In court, prosecutors presented an overall picture of Strong's behavior and tendencies. They introduced testimony from individuals who had previous relationships with him, describing controlling and abnormal behaviors they had experienced. These testimonies did not directly prove the crimes, but they helped clarify the psychological profile and behavioral patterns of the defendant. Although most of the surveillance systems at the related locations had been destroyed before authorities arrived, technical experts were still able to recover part of the data from damaged hard drives using advanced digital analysis methods. The recovered data not only confirmed the existence of a professional recording system, but also provided a crucial sequence of images documenting the movement of victims, their confinement in enclosed spaces, and subsequent activities related to handling the aftermath. Although many segments were missing or fragmented, when reconstructed in chronological order, investigators were able to piece together a sufficiently clear timeline to determine the time of death of multiple victims, including Maria, turning previously isolated missing cases into specific time markers within a single operational system. Just a few months after the verdict was delivered, in July 2021, Adam Strong unexpectedly provided new information during an exchange with a correctional officer at the detention facility. This time, there were no evasive or ambiguous answers like in previous interrogations. He gave a specific detail: the location where Candace Fitzpatrick's body had been buried for many years. This information was quickly passed on to investigators, and a search operation was organized based on Strong's statement. At the indicated location, authorities conducted an excavation and ultimately confirmed the site more than 13 years after Candace had gone missing. This was the first time her family received a concrete answer about her fate, a step toward closure for a case that had lasted over a decade. Even so, the case still left many unanswered questions. The nearly 10-year gap between the two victims raised concerns about what had happened during that time. No one knows exactly how Strong encountered the victims, what led to the criminal acts, or whether there may have been other undiscovered cases. This was not just a case that ended with a verdict, but also a reminder that some truths only come to light when the final pieces are found, and sometimes there are still pieces that never appear. The case concluded with a sentence for Adam Strom, but what it left behind was more than just a legal outcome. A life that was trying to change came to an abrupt end, and a family was left to live with an irreplaceable loss. This is not only the story of a crime, but also a reminder that unusual signs can sometimes appear within what seems completely ordinary, and whether we recognize or overlook them can make a difference. This case also shows that the truth can remain hidden for a long time. Matters is not only justice, but also awareness of our surroundings, changes in behavior, and each individual's responsibility to pay attention to others. The content in this video has been produced based on the real case of Adam Strom, Rory Hatch, and Candace Fitzpatrick in Oshawa, Canada, for the purpose of providing information and analysis from an educational perspective. If you want to follow more cases like this, please subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss upcoming videos.